Hello again. So this is an example of the researcher formatted mini lecture. So in the previous lecture, I did lecture you based on the content of the PowerPoint. I'm not going to do that this round. What I'm going to do is explain why I moved some of the material around and my thoughts behind that. So I start off with looking at neoclassicism. Now, these are all the same slides that I used in the previous lecture. What I'm doing now is I'm providing you with what came before, and I provide the same information that I provided before. As a break in the content of the lecture, I throw in the comparison between neoclassicism and romanticism, which I discussed in the previous lecture. So what I've done is I'm stacking, I'm introducing a pre-movement to romanticism by providing you with the overview of what that movement was. Then I'm showing you an example of the neoclassical painting style and the romantic painting style. I move then on to explaining the romantic movement and what it was attempting to produce. Moving from there, I now begin to start introducing some of the research questions. So we start off with the three estates and France's political structure. We move into an overview of the religious conflicts. Now, if you recall what I did in the previous research question lecture, this was really at the forefront of the material because it preceded everything else. Even though the way I asked the questions, it was like the third or the fourth question down, but chronologically, it belonged up on the, at the beginning to sort of lay some context of what was actually going on in the French state during these 200, 300 years. And I bring in the French Revolution at this point, and I introduce the painting of Louis XVI being walked to his execution. I then talk here. I would it be introducing French and English English reactions to the French Revolution, which we discussed in the previous lecture. And then I get into the schools, and I bring the schools into it. And I start with the French school because that's really where I want to begin the romantic discussion. But what I did, which is probably slightly different than what you might do, is that I did include all of the schools that fall under the Romanticism movement. So we have, I pop in English slavery here because I think it's important to know that in the midst of all of this, we did have the slavery movement be abolished in England and its colonies. I talk about the British school because there are certainly differences between the French school, which was very political in what it was representing, whereas the British school, since they didn't have the same political conflicts that were going on in France or in the United States, that the British were able to focus on more visually lyrical paintings of the landscape and of rural life. One of the things that we didn't talk about in the other lecture, which I'll just bring up here, is that we are at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we're starting to see in Britain particularly a movement from an agricultural society to an industrial society. But we're at the very beginnings of this. We're at the very beginnings of the railroads coming to England. We're at the very beginning of factories. The excavation of coal on a massive level to feed the factories start evolving and becoming part of the landscape. But the landscapes that we're presented with are very idealized, but also with the intensity of nature, which I discussed in the Constable painting in the previous lecture. We have the Spanish school. Again, we discussed this before. We have the German school, the Nazarenes, and the Visionaries. And then we wind up with the American Romantic school. And then we go into the references, which are exactly the same as in the other. So what you can get from this little bit of a difference is I chose a format that didn't exactly follow each of the questions. And that's an acceptable way to do it. What it comes down to, if you choose to do a research formatted lecture, is think about how you want the pieces to connect. I think I probably did an acceptable job of connecting them. Part of the issue is that I don't think either one of my lectures are 10 minutes. But that's okay. I'm the instructor. I can play with that a little bit. These were examples that I were going to give you, and we weren't able to do that for the circumstances that occurred. If you find that your whether it's the research question format or the research format that you choose to do for the lecture, if there's anything missing, then find something to fill the hole in within your time frame. And this also means that you should be discussing this with your research partners. I hope both of these examples, as well as the building the mini lecture recording, are helpful.